E3. And when you go through the videos, you're going to then be seeing a lot of Rendani on the videos, but we're then going to meet when we then do live sessions. And I can't really wait, Rendani, to meet my students so that we can then ensure that we are successful this year. So it's very much important, and I just want to then talk on the approach that I'm then going to then have when we then deal with our classes. And the approach that I'm going to then have, instead of just reteaching the content, what I'm going to then do is that we're going to then have a lot of engagement. We're going to have a lot of critical thinking where we're going to then be using real life scenarios in order for us to then, engage on those scenarios and then just make sure that we have our thought process right. Because after you then do your objective test and then you then go and do your case study, that is then the thought process that is going to then be needed from you guys. So we're then going to then be starting with then the thought process when we then go in our classes. So I just can't wait for us to then have that that engagement, and I'm looking forward to it. So how I then tell my students in terms of strategy and how they need to think about it, right? So I'm going to take a step back now, and I'm just going to then wear my financial reporting hat, because most of you guys then are familiar with financial reporting and financial statements. So if you then take a look at the financial statements, you'll then see that we have the three financial statements. And if we then go deeper to it, we then now have the cash flow. And the cash flow statement is then divided into three layers, right? So I want you guys to then stay with me here. So in those three layers, each and every business, for it to then grow, it has to make business decisions, right? So it does not matter whether you're a startup, it does not matter whether you are a big business, but you then need to make those business decisions. And those business decisions have to now be in line with your strategy as a company. So all the business decisions that I'm making have to then be in line with my strategy. So it's very much important, firstly, to then have the right strategy, because the business decisions that I'm going to then make are then going to then be in line with the strategy. And if my strategy is not on par, it means that I then make decisions that won't then create the value to the company and the value to the shareholders. And then we've seen, some companies like Motorola, they were making business decisions, but because their strategy was not at par, they then ended up failing and not succeeding as a company. So as a company, you then need to have the strategy so that the business decisions that you are then making are then in line with the strategy of the company. And then at the end of the day, you then have to be successful. So what are those business decisions that a company has to then make? So if you then go to the cash flow, you see that it's divided into three layers, right? The first layer being the operational. So a company has to then make the operational decisions. The second one will then be the investment decision. So each and every company, and it does not matter whether you are a startup, it does not matter whether you are a big business, you then need to make an investment decision for you to then grow. Then the last decision will then be the financing decision that you then need to make. And then the financing decision again must then be in line with the strategy of the company. And now it becomes interesting because different businesses can then be in the same industry, but then have different strategies, and then they make different business decisions. And if we then take, for example, if we take Woolworth and Boxer, for example, Woolworth just then made a decision to say they're going cashless, meaning that you don't have to then pay fiscal money when you then go to the stores. But then if you then see the type of business that Boxer is, it can then go and make the same strategy, although these two businesses are in the same industry, right? Because of the risks that then Boxer will then be facing, and also the type of market that it then has, it will then go for a different strategy, although the businesses are in the same industry. So it's very much important that you then consider the business, you consider your strategy, you then consider your environment as well. And these are some of the things that we're then going to unpack when we then have our classes, just to make sure that we have that thought process to say, why is then a company making such a financial strategy decision, and why is it a company making such a business decision? And then we then go to engage on that. So I can't really wait to then engage. So I'm gonna switch off my video. I think you guys have seen me now, and then we then going to then go through our slides. All right. So with the with the F3 syllabus, it's then divided into the 4 content areas. And then as you can see, they will then have different weightings, meaning that when we then go and then have those live sessions, we might then focus on business valuation, for example, because it has then more weighting, right? And then we can also then focus on the others, but we'll then consider the weighting, and then if it then has more weighting, we'll then have more engagements on that area. And then with business valuation, again, I was a bit lucky to then have friends also who are in the financing areas, and we have had consultation in terms of some of the valuations that they are then doing there in the market, so that those are then the experience that we're then going to be bringing in terms of those discussions, and just again making it applicable to the industry, making it applicable to the real case scenarios that are really happening out there. So those are some of the things that we then going to then discuss. Then we're also going to discuss sources of long-term funds. So this, again, it's linked to our financing decision that I then spoke about, right? So for you to then have those investments, you can then do investments, but you then need financing as well, right? So those two things are aligned, because I might then wake up tomorrow and think that I can then invest in this and that, but without then the financing, it becomes an issue. So we're then going to then touch on those sources of financing, and then how you then need to think about when you then formulate your financial strategy. Do I then go with debt? What are the risks that are associated with debt? Do I then go with equity? And what are the risks that are associated with that equity? And if I'm saying that my financial strategy as well is debt, what kind of debt am I then going for, right? So those are the things that you then need to then start thinking about. And obviously, say you are a startup company. If you're a startup company, you wouldn't then, I would then expect you to then go and be able to get debt, right? So it might be then a bit difficult for you to then go and get that debt, but then you might then need a bit of equity from the directors for you to then make those investments. So it's very much important that when you then come with a financial strategy, you then are able to evaluate all those things, and then you then come with the strategy. Because if you then don't come with the right strategy, it means that you can then be faced with a wall, and then you might not then be successful because you don't have the right strategy, although you are making those business decisions. So it's very much important that when we talk about the financial strategy, we then evaluate the company, we evaluate the environment, so that we then are able to make the right strategy for the company. We are also going to then talk about financial risks. So again, these are very much important, because as a company, you want to then be proactive. So you want to then sit and say, what are then the risks that can arise, right? And what are those financial risks that I then need to be mindful of before I even go and think about investments and think about all these other things. I then need to think about my risk, because if you then do that, you are actually taking a proactive approach to say that when I then face that risk, and then when the risk arises, already I would have thought about it. And then it becomes easier for me to then deal with the risk, right? But if I then don't think about these things, and I don't take that proactive approach of thinking about all these risks, so I then run a risk of, when it comes, it's a shock, and then it means that I won't then be able to then deal with those risks. So risks are then very much important. And then we're also going to then spend a bit of time in terms of just understanding the financial risks that are there. The risk of us as well not being able to then get those funds, but we still need to grow our company. How are we then going to then maneuver through that? Because at the end of the day, we need to then increase the value of the company. We need to grow the company. We need to make investments. But then if we're then faced with this financial risk, how then do we then go about it so that we can then achieve the objective, which is to then grow our company? So we're also then going to touch on that. All right. Then if we then just go a bit, deeper on those content areas that we're then going to focus on. So the first one will then be the financial policy decision. And this one, we then need to just understand that we can't then make it in isolation without considering the strategic objectives of the company. So we have to then have the objective, and then we can then make those financial policy, and then we make those financial decisions. And it means that we now need to then consider a lot of things. Now we need to consider our environment, we need to consider our financial market landscape, and just how the interest rate as well and the regulation can then have an impact on those financial policies that we then need to make. So we then need to start thinking about these things before we then make a financial policy or we then make a decision. Because again, we don't want to make an incorrect decision, because all our business decision, if we make an incorrect strategy, all our business decisions are going to then be aligned to our strategy. And then it means that, again, we're going to have that wall and we might not then be successful. So before we then make the policies, we then need to make sure we do what? We then need to make sure we then consider all these things that will then affect the policies that we then are going to make, right? Then we're going to talk again and focus on sources of long-term funds. And then here again, it's where we're then going to determine the mix of our long-term funds. Are we then going with debt? Are we then going to go with equity? And if we're going with debt, what kind of debt are we then going with? And the risks that are associated with that debt as well, right? We have commitments that we then need to make in terms of the interest that we have to then be paying it over. There is a lot of things that also limit us. So you can then have the debt, and then one of them, the conditions might then be you need to first pay off this debt for you to then go and then get another debt. So it means now we are limited in terms of getting the funds, because if I then go for this loan or for this debt, I then have 5 years of not going for another debt, for example. And then remember, opportunities are going to then be coming. Investment opportunities are going to be coming as well, meaning I then lose out on those investment opportunities that are there. So it means that I then need to make sure that I determine the right mix that I want to then go for. Is it debt? Is it equity? And again, if I'm thinking about equity, I'm thinking about bringing shareholders. And then now I'm starting to think about the dilution of the control. I might not then be able to set the strategy and make those decisions. It means now there are people who are there who will then have to also determine the future of the company and the strategy that we are then taking. So you then have to then think about those different things. And during our live sessions, those are the things that we then going to then be unpacking, so that we then understand how they will affect your financial strategy, and how then you then need to start thinking about those things. Then we have financial risk. And like I said, financial risk or risks are very much important, because we have to then be proactive in our approach. And we need to then be thinking about these things, so that when they come, we then know that, oh, we have considered it already. And then this is how we're then going to go about it, right? And I'm also thinking about what happened in 2008, where we had that financial market crisis. So if you then had companies who already had diversified their funding sources, and then they've implemented as well a risk management strategy. It means during that financial market crisis, they were going to then be fine, right? Because there were a lot of companies that were liquidated during that time. And most of them is because they didn't sit down and then assess the risk to say, what if we don't get funding anymore? What if it's hard for us to attract enough funding? What is then our strategy then? What do we then do? How do we go about it? So they ended up being liquidated because now they don't have the financing to then invest or to fund their investment, which then grows their business. But then people who had the risk management strategies and also diversified in terms of their funding sources, meaning that these people would have then taken a step back and then considered some of these risks that are there to say, what if this happens? What if this happens? How then do we then go about it? They really survived and they were better positioned to weather the storm, right? So it's very much important to then be able to have a financial strategy that will then talk to your financial risks and then help you as management to then understand those risks, and you have to then explain them to the board as well to say these are our financial risks and this is how they affect then our company. So those are some of the things that we are then going to unpack. Then the last area will then be the business valuation, right? So remember, as a business, uh, for us to then start a business, we aim to increase the value of the business, right? So that's our number one goal. We can't just start a business to then make losses and all those things. So we are then starting this business to say we want to then increase the value of the business, and we want to increase the value of the shareholders as well, right? By increasing the value of the business. So you then need to be able to value your business. So that's the first thing. So you then need to then determine what are the measures that I can then use to say that my business is successful, to say that my business now has increased in value. What then will you then use to measure the value of your business? And those are something that we are again going to then touch on. Again, if you want to acquire a business, right? So you then need to think, what are then the measures, what are then the technique that I can then use to then value this business, right? So we've seen a lot of measures and acquisition happening. So those are the scenarios that we're going to bring as well in our classes so that we can then go through them and then see what was the thought process of all these the measures and acquisition, right? What did they do a due diligence to understand the company? Which method did they use? Which technique did they use to then value this business? What were the synergies that were there, right? Did they consider the synergies to say these are the synergies of this business that I'm acquiring, or these are the synergies of us then measuring or having this measure and becoming one business, right? So we then going to then talk on those. There are a lot of examples as well that have happened when businesses are acquiring other businesses. You think about your Facebook as well when they acquired Instagram, right, in 2008. So they had to first go through the synergies that are then going to be there before they acquired this business, right? They had to then value this business and then see the value in the business before they then they then acquired this business. And what does this tell us? It tells us that accurate valuation will then determine if the company is successful or not. So imagine if Facebook had acquired Instagram, but then Instagram failed as a company and didn't increase in value. You would have then invested your time, you will then have invested your resources, you will then have invested your finances as well into this business deal that you didn't really evaluate well. You didn't really consider all the synergies. You didn't really value this business well, right? And then now you have made this investment. And remember, when we talk about strategic investments, those are long-term investments, meaning that if I wake up today and then I say I'm acquiring this company, it has long-term implication. So I can't just wake up tomorrow again and then I say, actually, I want to reverse that decision that I've made, right? So this has long-term implication. So it means that it's very much crucial that we understand business valuation, we understand the techniques that we then have to employ when we then value a business, and just the synergies around the transitions. So this is something that we also then going to then be discussing and unpacking in our live sessions, and it's going to be very much interesting because we're going to be bringing these scenarios that are out there in the public, and then we then just think about them in different angles as well, to say, what if they thought about this, what if they included this, what would have then been the decision of this company. So we're going to then have those engagements, and it will then help us as well when we then go to the case study, so that we can then have this thought process and be able to then think things in a strategic, but more importantly in a critical way, and then we can then be successful when we then go to our business case study. All right. Then these slides then is just then dealing with the topics that we then going to touch. So for financial policy decisions, we are going to then touch strategic financial objectives, your 9 financial objective, and how you then can develop a financial strategy, right? And then this becomes very much important because, like I said, the strategy is the umbrella, meaning that the business decisions that we're going to then make will then be under this umbrella. So it's very much crucial that when we develop the financial strategy, we then develop the right strategy, and then we make sure that we have evaluated and we have considered everything that we then have to consider. Then we're going to talk again sources of long-term financing. So I've already touched on this, right? We're going to talk about your equity finance, your debt finance, and then your capital structure. And then your capital structure, that's where now you are determining your mix to say that actually, when I go for my investments, I want them to be 40% of debt and 60% of equity. So that will then be my mix. Obviously, you'll consider a lot of things. Equity is more expensive than debt. Debt has your interest, and the interest is a cash flow. Your interest, you can then get the tax deduction, which is a cash flow. So it makes then the debt to be a bit cheaper as compared to equity, right? So you then going to then determine those things, those risks, and then you can then come up with your capital structure. So we're then going to go through that as well. We are going to then touch on financial risks again. So your financial risks, your currency risk management, your interest risk management, because when you go for financing, you have to then be paying the interest. Sometimes companies will then get foreign denominated rather, uh, loans, and it means that you now have to then be mindful of the currency fluctuations as well, and then that makes or falls part of your decisions and what you then have to evaluate. So we're then going to touch on this, and we're then going to then make sure that we then evaluate each and every risk and then see how it then affects our decision. So sometimes companies do deviate, right? So even the strategy, sometimes there might be a project, and then you are like, okay, we have this strategy, we have this policy, maybe let's deviate here because of this and this and that. However, you need to then justify that. So it has to be justified in a way that we will then agree to say, oh, okay, this is why we then did this. These are the benefits of us deviating, right? So obviously you don't want to deviate. So you want your strategy to be on par from the get-go. But sometimes you know things change. The environment also change. So it means that you might then need to deviate a bit. However, you then just need to make sure that you justify your decision to say these are the reasons, and then you have to then take that to the board, and you then have to then get approval for that. But there have to be a benefit to say, why am I now deviating and then going like this? but we're then going to talk about that as well. Then we're gonna finish with business valuations, and I've already touched on this. We're going to discuss your mergers and acquisitions, the synergies that are there, the benefits that are there, and we're gonna take real, the real scenarios that have been happening and just analyze them to say, okay, when this company was then merging with this company, what was then the thinking behind it? What was the thought process behind it? And how then do we go about it? Is it successful now? And then did they value this correctly, the whole business deal, right? So those are things that we then going to then touch on as well. We've been having audit firms as well merging together. So we can also then just take a look um, at some of those examples to say, okay, we see this auditing firm merging with this auditing firm. What were the considerations there? And then we can then engage on such issues so that at least we then see the thought process, because that's where I want you guys. I want you guys to then have the thought process behind why things are being done, right? Because I know we have a lot of bright minds. So you know when we talk about NPV, we have to take our cash flows. We know we have to take out non-cash items and all those things. But then we then need to start thinking about the reasoning behind all that. Why do we do what we have to do? And once we start thinking about those things, you'll see that the puzzle then starts to connect, and then we then determine the benefits and the synergies that are there when we then deal with these business valuations. So yeah, those are then the areas that we are then going to then cover. It will then be these 4 areas, and I'm really looking forward to having the engagements with you guys, and we just then think about things and then challenge each other. So yeah, I think that's the end. Thank you so much. I don't know if there's any questions. So if there's anyone who wants to then ask something, then you can go ahead. All right. If there's no question, thank you so much. Back to you, Randani.
Thank you so much, Manda. Yeah, and I think you've really captured it well, especially the fact that at this level, it's really about bringing it together. That financial strategy does not exist in isolation. It has to connect with the business strategy. And I'm sure as the candidates get to connect, they'll really get to see how you make them see that. So definitely going to be an exciting journey. Now let's really then jump to the last one before we call it a night.